Aloha mai kākou. Mahalo for joining us once again. My name is Jessie Ho, and I'm a research associate with the Environmental Law Program, and I am in 2L here.
Hi everyone, my name is Liz Neri. I'm a 3L, and I was the former president of the Student Animal Legal Defense Fund, and we're actually in the process of transferring to our new charity. But glad to see you all today.
And as you can tell by the screen, and as you can see by the flyers that have been up around campus, we're going to be talking today about food sovereignty in Hawaiʻi. Right now, I'd like to give a chance to our panelists to introduce themselves.
Hey, aloha mai nā hoa makamaka mai ka mokupuni nui o kia awea hiki I ho ke aloha kākou. My name is Noah Lincoln. I'm a 0L. I am took a water law course once. Loved it. I'm a professor in the Tropical Plant and Soil Sciences Department in the College of Tropical Ag. I run Indigenous cropping systems laboratory, so we really focus on the revitalization of our kupuna crops, our traditional Pacific crops, into our contemporary food systems. And we kind of think about that really across scales. So everything from kind of the household and community level, focusing more on biocultural restoration, restoring our ecosystems for food production and community feeding, all the way up to kind of the commercial farmer scale, thinking about the economic realities of how these crops can fit into our contemporary systems.
And I'm Albie Miles. I'm an associate professor of sustainable community food systems at the UH West Oahu campus. My research kind of spans the biophysical sciences and the social sciences, and I'm very interested in kind of examining the structural obstacles and opportunities for food system change toward the realization of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And I have a particular interest in kind of the as a side, the legal status and the moral status of highly sentient non-human beings. So for those people who are involved in the animal law, I think I'd love to follow up that topic. Thank you for having us, and we're looking forward to the conversation.
Mahalo. Before we get into more of this discussion, we have a few announcements and housekeeping rules. Number one is please sign in if you haven't already. And number two is this meeting will be recorded. It's going to be recording this way. So please rest assured that I don't think your faces will be in the recording, but if you speak up, they might take that up. We also have an upcoming climate change event that is going to be next week. Sorry, it's a little bit difficult to see right now.
Thursday.
Thursday, April 10th, and it's going to be moderated by Professor Maxine Burkett, who is our climate law and policy professor right now. If you're interested, please sign up and RSVP, and lunch will be served to those who do RSVP and show. Since the QR code is a little bit small, I've also included it right here. And if you see the flyers around campus, you can also sign up there or via the email announcements that have gone out. Next, we want to give a shout out. Noah and Albie are coming from, or they are co-directors from KO Center for Sustainable Island Food Systems. And KO Center is a University of Hawaii system initiative dedicated to advancing multidisciplinary research and education, planning and policy analyses, and community development activities to realize a healthy, equitable, resilient, and ecologically sustainable food system for the people and the land of Hawaii. If you're interested in learning more about their systems, their programs that are available, please sign up. Please use the QR code to go to their website. And again, it is here. And finally, there is a Jefferson Fellowship application for anyone who's interested in doing food sustainability throughout the summer and the year. This is a fully funded trip to Southeast Asia, from here to Southeast Asia, and I believe it is a journalism scholarship. So if you're interested in writing about news in Southeast Asia and how the food systems there work, please sign up. And the applications are due on April 13th. This is for anyone throughout the whole UH system. Again, here's the QR code for that. Okay. So we have some QR codes on the table as well. If you have questions, please feel free to submit them throughout the event and we'll come back to them after we finish the presentation that we have planned for you today.
So our first question is, what is food sovereignty to you?
All right, game on. Yeah, so it's a big, broad question. And I guess I would start by answering that, I really think it's important to acknowledge, right, the role of sovereignty in any discussion of food sovereignty. And, I don't think we're going to dwell or focus on that tonight, but, do want to just lay the context of, the fact that at an international law level, as well as a national law level, there has been acknowledgement that the Hawaiian Kingdom was an independent kingdom that had nation-to-nation treaties with the United States that were violated. And, it's the opinion of the International Court of The Hague that, the Kingdom of Hawaii is in some weird, prolonged military occupation state. And that, it's a little bit hard to talk about food sovereignty and ignore, kind of a elephant underlying that whole thing of that, there is, I think, a discussion of true sovereignty. And those things are related, right? So food sovereignty, if you read a textbook definition, I think is around the, rights and freedom of an individual or a community to have access to the types of foods that they want, be they culturally appropriate or environmentally appropriate. But really around that individual sovereignty of choosing the foods that we do. But the ability to engage in foods are highly dependent on the socioeconomic context that we're in. So for instance, if we want to choose to eat foods that are grown in a certain economic way or certain cultural foods that aren't very prevalent, like those are going to come at a cost premium. And unless you're making, a reasonable living and you're doing economically well, you probably can't engage in those foods because of our socioeconomic system, might be prohibitive in that. For me personally, part of my personal food sovereignty definition for just me as an individual would be to be able to partake in the growing of my own food, right? But if land is unavailable or unattainable and you're not able to engage in that, right, then you're not really able to pursue your food sovereignty. And so, yeah, I think it's a deeply entwined concept that relates to a whole range of justice and equality issues that are situated within a context of our socioeconomic system. And so there's kind of, I think, layers you need to peel back when you start talking about food sovereignty. And with that enigma, I will pass it over to Albie.
So I'm in full agreement with what Noah had described, and I would just say or reiterate that food sovereignty is really about a community, a society, or a nation state to be self-determining around their food and agricultural systems, how that food is produced, who has access to it, and whether or not they are economically and politically empowered to engage in forms of production and consumption that are aligned with their cultures and more self-sufficient economies. And so I'll just share what has happened, of course, in the context of globalization of the agri-food system is you have very large-scale production happening in areas outside of Hawaii and outside of other nations. And because of the comparative advantage of certain areas of production, then those commodities are produced at a very low cost and they can flood into markets where those foods may have been historically produced, but they are no longer economically viable for local producers to produce that commodity. Think of rice, right? It's an internationally traded commodity. There's all kinds of nations where they are no longer net rice producers because of the flood of, Arkansas and California rice into Korea, for example. Right. So the process of economic globalization in food and agricultural sector has fundamentally undermined the food sovereignty of many communities and nations around the world. And that's a major structural obstacle that we'll talk in greater detail about. Thank you.
Mahalo. Our next question is, can you provide some context to what food sovereignty is, how food sovereignty looks here in Hawaiʻi right now?
I can take elements of this on, and I'm going to kind of defer to Noah to talk much more about like Native Hawaiian food sovereignty. I'm going to talk about other elements. Is this the question where we're to really engage in current status of the food and agricultural sector? Is that what you wanted to do? Okay. So a couple of kind of data points around the food and agricultural system of Hawaii that I think it's important for everybody to be aware of. And that is fundamentally, Hawaii is not producing much of its own food. As many of you have read, if you're familiar with some of this literature, the estimates vary, but somewhere around 15% of the foods that we consume here in Hawaii, mostly fresh fruits, vegetables, and fish, are produced or harvested here in Hawaii. 85% is imported from all over the world, significant portions of our fresh fruits and vegetables coming from California, but commodities are flowing across the globe. Right? So we are, in terms of a food self-sufficiency ratio, about 15% food self-sufficient, 85% dependent upon imports from elsewhere. So that largely has to do with, and Noah can go into greater detail on this, a history of colonial occupation, dispossession, structural racism, economic marginalization of the self-subsistence society and foodways here in Hawaii, and fundamentally transforming Hawaii from a society and a culture that was based on subsistence agriculture to one where it became more economically rational to import greater amounts of food in the context of the plantation era. So, that's just a bit of broad context around, our food self-sufficiency ratio. A couple other important points I want to share in terms of food access, no matter where that food is coming from. Again, in the context of globalization, where commodities are flowing into the state from all over the world, about 30% of Hawaii households are food insecure. No matter where that food is coming from, they do not have enough access to that food. So about 30% of households in Hawaii, about 30% of children, and the rate of household food insecurity in the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community is even higher. It's about 40%. And this is based on data that Catherine Perkle and the Hawaii Food Bank recently published based on a study in 2023. So we're importing a significant majority of our food. 30% of households are food insecure. And much of the food that's flowing into Hawaii, it's important to understand, is really in a just-in-time basis, meaning we're like a big household ordering stuff off of Amazon. We don't really store much food in state. The Hawaii Emergency Management Agency estimates we have somewhere around a 3 to 5 day supply of food were the Port of Honolulu to be closed. So high levels of food import dependence, high rates of household food insecurity, very low levels of commercial and emergency food storage. The Hawaii Emergency Management Agency does not store food. FEMA stores somewhere around 3 days of food and water for enough people on this island. We recently did a study looking at the rates of household emergency preparedness. About 12% of households have enough emergency food, water, and medicine to weather the storm of some interruption of the commodity chains coming into the port of Honolulu. So high levels of food import dependence, high rates of household food insecurity, very low levels of disaster preparedness going into a period of increasing climate destabilization. And so last thing I'll share is also because of histories of economic discrimination, racial oppression, you see a lot of people in the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community experiencing much higher rates than the average Hawaii citizen in terms of chronic illness and premature mortality that's related to diet. So those are a couple of major factors that are circumstances in terms of the food system of Hawaii, and I want to turn it back to Noah to share some additional details. So we're just trying to paint the picture of what does the food system look like today? And so beyond the kind of ideal of being food self-sufficient, we're not actually meeting many of the goals that we often ascribe to the food system, whether that food is produced here or produced anywhere else. So I'll stop here.
Yeah, thanks. It's great. It's a great overview. So yeah, I would just add a little context to that. I think it'll start at the same place actually, that Hawaii does import 85% of our food to the state. We hear that fact all the time. And it's repeated like it's something special, but actually if you look at just about any state in the US, guess how much food do they import? About 85%. It's actually not uncommon in the United States. And what that really says, right, is that we're just part of this like crazy national and international, right, network of food distribution that is part of the disempowerment of making any choice, right? Because if we're a tiny place and a unique place, right, a unique culture, unique history, unique climate, unique foods, but we don't get to make those choices because we're just a tiny player in this huge international web of food system. And so, that really relates then to, I think a lot of the non-food benefits of food. And I think when you look at any culture around the world, the cultural identities are very, very strongly tied to food. And so when we look at movements of food sovereignty in Hawaii, I think it's unsurprising that I would argue they're largely led by Native Hawaiian initiatives because so much of our culture is tied to the food and the food production, right? When you look at our religion, the manifestation of our akua and our genealogies are tied to kalo and to these foods. When you think about how we traditionally educated our children and our families, it was through the practice of agriculture. The stories were embedded in our crops and our food that allowed the transmission of values and histories through the generations. And ultimately, like identity and, sense of self and confidence of a people, I would argue are very, very strongly tied to food. And so I do think, we're seeing a lot of community-led initiatives that are seeking to restore that decision-making process that we are disempowered in from the background, right, that Albie gave, in order to reclaim these essential parts of who, we are as people and as individuals. And, I like the analogy of like we're just a giant store like ordering, right? Because that's what it starts to feel like if we don't have choice of expression and engagement in that process. And so when we look at this 85% right import, that again is not necessarily unique to Hawaii, those choices are what succeeds in that really, really large food network is heavily influenced by history and policy and economic power. And so we see a tremendous subsidization of larger and larger farms and of fewer and fewer crops and of more and more processed food that is allowing a competitive advantage of what I would say are really shitty foods to be pervasive in our food system. And there's like a reason why a Big Mac is cheaper than a salad at McDonald's. Because the beef industry is heavily subsidized because they have beef is tied back to the colonization of the West and the reclamation of the West and the land settlement movement that gave these people early power that then allowed them to build cattle lobbies and get into politics and get their head cattlemen. Like you look how many governors and senators used to be cattlemen in the past. They had a tremendous amount of political clout that shaped whole directions and whole chunks of the Farm Bill that then start locking in these food aspects as a status quo. And then that becomes very hard to break out of. And so it's a self-reinforcing system that over the past 2 centuries has led to a tremendous narrowing of our food system, both in terms of who is growing food and the crops that are being grown. And that has gotten smaller or narrower and narrower over time, and that trend is still continuing. And so all of that, I think, works to kind of disenfranchise individuals universally, I would say globally, from really having a choice and a say in what are they eating and what are they getting to choose to eat, because that menu is becoming smaller and it's, again, self-reinforcing, so it's getting harder and harder to break into it and diversify as well. And I think there's one more thing I want to say. That's all right, it'll come back. Awkward.
So Noah, you touched a little bit on the fact that some of these movements are led by Native Hawaiians and locals. But could you each of you provide some more details on the structural limitations to greater food sovereignty and sustainability here in Hawaii?
Yeah, I did remember I wanted to say though, real quick. So while it's not unique that Hawaii imports 85% of our food, there are unique aspects of Hawaii that make that that statistic a little scarier. You know, because we are physically remote, we are physically at the end of supply chains, we are, economically, not at the top of the barrel in the US. And so all of those things make us less food secure, in meaning that disruptions, social or natural disruptions to the larger food system means Hawaii is inherently more at risk than a lot of other places. So same stat, but actually different context and a slightly scarier context for us. And the question, sorry, can you repeat the question?
Could you just provide more context and details on the structural limitations for greater food sovereignty and sustainability in Hawaii? Okay.
I'll go first because that's Albie's bread and butter and he'll take all the good answers. Yeah, I think the biggest, it's a lot of structural limitations. Certainly some of the biggest ones are economic, right? Land and labor costs in Hawaii are extremely high compared to most anywhere else. And because we're in a, kind of national and international competitive economic state, that places us at a huge disadvantage for anything that we want to produce. And the I think the way to overcome that structural barrier, right, is to put real limitations and productions on agricultural land that limit the usage, reserve it for agriculture. And so you don't have, right, speculation, or you don't have direct competition of agricultural land and residential lands, right? So if you go to the North Shore of Hawaii, or Oahu, sorry, right, ag land's $1 million an acre. You know, there's no way that is viable for any sort of farmer. And so you don't get farmers up there, right? You get, you know, kind of gentleman farmers with a mansion on a piece of land that's a pet horse, and that qualifies for an ag exemption. And so, you know, they're getting tax breaks and water breaks, but really not contributing to the food situation at all. You know, we're starting to see some movement in that area in the last decade. And I would say the land trusts are really leading that. So Trust for Public Lands, Hawaiʻi Island Land Trusts are really pushing and working with landowners to place conservation easements on ag land, right? Restrict the allowable usage of that land that lowers the land value. Makes it so you can't build a mansion on it, makes it more affordable for people to actually keep it in agriculture. So that's one, and then the other one I would just say before passing to Albie is you know, for a solid 2 centuries, you know, plantations were a huge player in Hawaii, and so almost all the physical, the social, and to some extent the political infrastructure around agriculture was geared exclusively toward plantation export agriculture of a few commodity crops. And so, you know, when it came to exporting sugar, like, we were really well set up. We had the machinery, we had the irrigation canals, we had the, you know, immigration labor and the labor laws that went with that. We had, you know, trade agreements with other businesses and organizations, and all of that was set up for plantation sugar. So when the plantations failed and we now are trying to transition into something new, if we really want to transition into a local agricultural system, or even a diversified export agriculture, a whole different suite of infrastructure is needed. And I would say, when I say infrastructure, I mean, yes, the physical infrastructure, right? So if we want to do local vegetables, you need cold chain integrity to go from the farm to the consumer in a refrigerated pathway. And, you know, you need these physical infrastructures that don't really exist in Hawaii yet, and won't without investment. And you need social infrastructure, you know, so when the plantations broke up, you know, when it was a plantation, the social infrastructure was very easy. You had one owner, and you had a hierarchy of employees, and everyone was working because they're getting paid, and you had these large players that could negotiate and do all this stuff. But now that we've broken up these plantations, and we have, you know, 7,000 small farms in Hawaii, there's a whole range of social infrastructure that needs to be developed that can allow these small farms to reach any sort of scale. Like, we're not, I don't want to say we're not going to achieve food sovereignty with like 7,000 farmers selling at farmers markets. Like, maybe that is a model, but it's a difficult model in today's socioeconomic system. And so if you look at, for instance, the largest food purchaser in the state is the Department of Education. The way our DOE is set up is we're a single school district. So all 284 public schools are a single food contract currently. And so if you want to supply the DOE with food, which is legislatively mandated now that the DOE spend 30% of their school budget on local food by the year 2030, if you want to supply the DOE, you have to supply all 284 schools, and you have to be able to do it on a single day. There's very, very few, if any, farms big enough in Hawaii to do that. And so if we want to connect our local small-scale production to large markets like the DOE, we need social coordination that allows the aggregation, quality control, distribution, processing that can feed into something like the DOE. And that's an extreme example because they're the biggest, but even a restaurant, right? They want consistent product, they want it all the time, and they want good quality. And it's hard as a single farm to do that. And so that's where I think we're starting to see the emergence of things like food hubs or cooperatives that are starting to build that social capital and collaboration across farms, allowing connection to some of these bigger markets.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'll pick up a couple of strands that Noah has touched on, and I think it's important. So Noah mentioned, right, we recently exited this period of plantation agriculture. And it's important, even though there are 7,000 small farms, much of the land is still owned by, the legacies of the big five, right? And the terms of, for example, they're not necessarily selling those chunks of land, they're leasing them. And often, as Noah knows well, often those lease terms are not favorable for many of our local agriculturalists. Sometimes they're very short-term leases that discourages people from planting perennial crops, for example. And the short-term nature of some of the leases, for example, does not encourage sound stewardship of those lands. And so with that also as kind of background and context, it's important to understand that, as Noah also mentioned, farmers in Hawaii face the highest cost of production anywhere, right? Electricity, the land costs, their associated housing costs, the labor costs, and you name it, it adds up. And we're dealing with relatively small scale production. And that has to then be in competition with these large scale industrialized operations. I'm from California. There are 25,000 acre lettuce farms in the area where I grew up. So even though lettuce is slightly competitive here in Hawaii, other commodities that are produced at these industrialized scale in areas of high levels of specialization is very difficult for a local farmer to, say, produce rice. There's more rice under cultivation in California and Arkansas alone than all the ag land in Hawaii. So a farmer's not going to grow rice in Hawaii because they know that Albie Miles is not going to pay $15 a pound to buy rice, even though I'm dedicated to this stuff. That's an important factor, right? Is many people, because of the overall high cost of living here in Hawaii, are looking at how can they cut costs. And where do people shop? They don't shop at the farmer's market, they shop at Costco. Why? Because it's affordable. And it makes economic sense at the household level that that's where everybody seems to go. So there are these options, but as Noah said, unless you have a fair disposable income to make that selection to purchase what are often a higher priced commodity relative to what you can get at Costco or Walmart or wherever, then there's a limited support for domestic agriculture. Add to it the lack of commitment on the part of institutions, whether it's the state government, whether it's the tourism industry to support our local ag sector, then again, we're not channeling those economic assets, those dollars into supporting the local ag sector, right? So that adds up to a kind of a limited or a cap on how much dollars are flowing into our local ag sector. Add to that, as as I understand it, is one of the reasons we no longer have a dairy industry is for a period of time, why Hawaii attempted to protect our dairy industry and was actually sued, right? Because of the conditions of the World Trade Organization, that a state like Hawaii cannot protect or subsidize their dairy industry. The state of Hawaii was sued. They of course lost that, given the conditions of liberalization of trade within the dictates of the WTO. And then there's the floodgates opened and cheap subsidized milk comes flowing into Hawaii and it decimates the dairy industry. So that's just another example, whether it's rice or whether it's milk, often subsidized commodities produced at an industrial scale with high levels of specialization in those areas where those commodities are produced, a local farmer is not going to be able to compete with the price point once those things reach the shelf here. So those are a few additional, I think, details around the structural challenges that we face. And so there may be some others, but I'll stop there.
You talked about the structural obstacles that are in the way of food sovereignty, but could you talk a little bit more about certain initiatives that are in place to promote food sovereignty here in Hawaii?
Sure. Well, I think I will start with kind of on the reverse end. Another obstacle is the fact that Hawaii does not have a plan. Like, given the outline of the challenges that Noah and I have been articulating, and there's a lot of them, right? There is no state level plan to move in the direction of greater sovereignty, greater food access. There's bits and pieces of legislation. There's federal programs that support households that are food insecure, but there is no comprehensive plan or vision to transform elements of the food system of Hawaii to achieve social, economic, cultural, and resilience objectives. And that's actually to transition then is we have been successful over the last couple of years building awareness within the state legislature that we need a state level food system plan or charter, as they're often called in other states, and much like 18 other states on the continent have. And that is to articulate, much like a transportation plan or any other kind of infrastructure plan, how are we going to get from point A, the current status of the food system of Hawaii with X-rated household food insecurity, et cetera, how are we going to move the dial on these different outcomes? And so there is a bill in front of the state legislature this legislative session, and it is to form a interagency food system working group to articulate a state level food system plan or charter. And it's intended to create much more of a omnibus approach. Like at the federal level, we have the Farm Bill that does all these different things. The state level food system plan or charter for Hawaii would articulate a range of integrated policy approaches that would tackle such things simultaneously as supporting our local agriculturalists, encouraging our tourism industry to buy more from our agriculturalists, providing tax incentives or other forms of acceptable subsidies, if you will, to support the adoption of conservation farming practices, right? Addressing the issue of the rate of poverty, which is high here in Hawaii, through increasing the minimum wage so people can actually live here and afford the foods that are produced here or imported into the state. So to me, I think that that's a kind of an early sign and approach to addressing the issue very partially around food sovereignty. It's more so focused on food sovereignty is an important, I think, value proposition. I don't think it's possible to become food self-sufficient here in Hawaii without radical fundamental changes to human society and the economy. So I don't hold that vision out for Hawaii broadly speaking, but we can improve some of the outcomes that the food system is currently generating, which are quite negative. And so I'm very cautiously optimistic and setting the bar relatively low when it comes to food sovereignty, but I do think we can improve some really important social, economic, and cultural outcomes of the food system. So.
Nice. Yeah, I think that was a great, overview of kind of the institutional, maybe kind of top-down things that our governments and institutions can and should be doing. So I'll come at it from, I think, the other way, which maybe isn't eliminating structural barriers in any way, but maybe thinking about how some of our grassroots efforts are working within those structural barriers or finding ways through them. And so one of the big successes I think we've seen is integrating food production with other value propositions. And so, recognizing that in economics, right, we externalize all the negative impacts. And so we can produce cheap food because we're ignoring the environmental, the cultural, all these costs, right? So that food comes out cheap. So if we want to do good food, it comes out expensive. But that good food comes with other positive outcomes. And so I think some of the success stories we're seeing are finding ways to monetize those positive outcomes. So I mean, here on Oahu, I think a great example is Maho Farms, right? Their mission is not to produce food. It's youth engagement and development. And through that lens, they become the largest certified organic vegetable producer in the state. So using, just like how in the past, right, so much of our values of education, culture, and whatnot were through food, they are doing that and acknowledging it, and then leveraging that to find funding to support those other values. And by bringing in funding that's supporting those other values, it's allowing them to subsidize their food production. And so I think, they're doing a good job, and there's a lot of examples like that. I think Ho'okua'aina, Dean Wilhelm guys, they are working with incarcerated youth and rehabilitation. That's a core mission and a value that they're doing, and agriculture is the avenue. And so again, bringing additional value to food production. I think we're seeing the emergence of the food is medicine movement, so that there are pilot programs now, right? So a poor diet is responsible for a huge amount of non-communicable diseases, right? Type 2 diabetes, obesity, hypertension, all of these things can be solved with a change of diet. And there are groups now that are actually leveraging that. And so there are pilot programs where you can literally get a medical prescription and get your insurance to pay for good foods as an intervention, as a health intervention, and bringing that additional value to subsidize the cost of the foods that are more expensive because we're producing them in a value-laden way. So I mean, I think I could go on, but there's a lot of examples of this kind of bringing in other forms of value into our food sovereignty and using that to allow these developments. I also think there's some creative solutions that we've seen. So again, like cost of land, I would say, is a huge structural barrier. And so people have been looking at ways around that. So Kekuewa Valley, I think, is a great example where they're actually operating on a state park. And it's a really unique arrangement. And there is another one like that on Kauai, where a community group has taken over a state park management. And so, I mean, they're paying like next to nothing for their land, but it comes with a whole bunch of strings and engagement, but allowing, community development, community health, lifestyle engagement through agriculture. But again, kind of found a creative solution, I think, around the land access issue. I think Keia is another great example with the fish pond and Kekuewa that are leveraging, again, both the land designations as well as, external values. In their case, I think largely environmental values is what they capitalize on. They do a lot of community engagement and education as well. But anyway, this integration, right? This re-acknowledgement that there's a lot more to food in terms of our societal outcomes than just calories. And once we acknowledge that there's a lot more value to food, we can actually think about, okay, how do we turn these values into value and get that into that system? Thank you. Didn't feel very articulate.
So you mentioned Kekuewa Valley and the Medical Legal Partnership Clinic here at the Richardson Law School actually works with KKV directly. So if you're interested in learning more about KKV and how they help the community through direct action, please sign up, and it's a great class. I'm currently in it. Wonderful time.
Nice.
Highly recommend. Could you also elaborate on how law students or community members in general could help promote your work and get involved?
Well, I think at the general citizen level, there's a lot of important legislation in front of the state legislature. If you believe and support that process, there's a couple of organizations that we both work closely with. One is called the Food Plus Policy Program, run through the Purple Maya Foundation. They have a state legislation system of tracking food and agriculture related bills. And so you can sign up for their mailing list so you can provide oral and written testimony in a timely way. So that's a service. I think the Hawaiʻi Alliance for Progressive Action has a similar kind of alert system where you can track bills through the legislative session. So that's more on a private citizen level. Getting actively involved in writing testimony and providing oral testimony to some of the bills that you're particularly passionate about. I think there's a lot of times where our legislators are not hearing enough from us. And so they're not seeing that these, whatever it is, a food system planning bill or a universal school meals bill, it's not important to the state. And so they're making decisions in part based on the amount of testimony and who the people are representing when they do provide testimony. So I would not underestimate, the power and influence of providing testimony at the state legislature. And it's very important, I hear repeatedly from some of my colleagues who are legislators, is that they want to hear from young people. They want to hear from students. They want to hear from young professionals about how these bills are influencing the well-being. As an aside, one of the things I do for the UH system is I conduct research on student basic needs and security. And there's profound levels of basic needs and security in the student population, and we will eventually be going to the state legislature to provide additional support for students so that they can stay in school and do well. If the students don't show up, they're not going to see this as being something that they want to invest in. So those are a couple of things. I think, Noah and I are running this new Kekuewa Center for Sustainable Island Food Systems. We have a fairly comprehensive, research agenda. If there are projects you're interested in collaborating with us on, we don't have legal backgrounds, as you probably have gathered, but we would be interested in looking at some of these legal and structural issues to see what we might be able to at least educate our legislators around. And I think that's also important. You, as a professional with technical expertise in the law, you provide a certain kind of testimony. And developing relationships with legislators, one of the activities that I've long envisioned is doing a 101 series with state legislators on the food system, so that they understand, why are we so concerned about our levels of disaster preparedness? Why should we care whether or not we have any food self-sufficiency here in Hawaii, right? They need to understand that these things are problematic. I spent some time at UC Santa Cruz, and there's a great rural sociologist. He's now deceased, but his name is Bill Friedland. And I was foaming at the mouth about organic agriculture, and he's like, Albie, food is not a problematic in the minds of many people. They get their 3 meals a day. They don't think about food. And so I think we who do think about food and are concerned about the outcomes of the food system need to help others who may not have that same nuanced level of understanding why these topics are important. Because otherwise, we go through the motions of submitting testimony or drafting bills with some of our legislators, and it just falls flat because they don't see the value. And they're doing their job of investing, hoping for a return on investment for things that their community may be interested in. So I think, that's a range of things that we can all do. Thank you.
Thanks for buying me some time. Yeah, so I guess thinking about it from the law perspective, I certainly think protecting and supporting community groups and the activities that they want to do. I think a great example is that there was a lot of legal issues around fish pond restoration 30 years ago. And really like the first few fish ponds that got restored were basically illegal and done by activists. And, a former JD really worked with NOAA and with the state government to change the actual laws around fish pond management and make exceptions in those rules to streamline the process and basically make it so that these communities could engage in kind of this biocultural restoration. So I think that's one. Kind of from the 10,000-foot view, I think there's a tremendous amount of high-level law work that could be done in the public trust doctrine arena. Hawaiʻi, again, my one law course was water law. But in water law, Hawaiʻi is extremely overrepresented in case law at the national level. And we've been very progressive in pushing the boundaries of defining what falls under the public trust and where governmental responsibility lies for protecting public good as it pertains to public resources. And so, the famous one here in Hawaiʻi is the Waiahole ditch case, in which Hawaiʻi was the first state to acknowledge cultural practicing, and in that specific case, growing kalo in a traditional way as protected under the public trust, and really opened the door for a lot of the water right activism that's going on now, really more in the legal sphere. With Maui, I would say, really being the kind of leading place, but that's resulted in, completely changing a whole bunch of the way the water is flowing on the island and the way that water rights are being allocated and prioritized, and has helped to push the change, I would say, the face of our water use commission that. On an island with limited resources, we talk about, you talk about something like how could agriculture ever compete with tourism? I can tell you one easy way: you take the water away from tourism, you give it to ag, and that totally shifts the balance of power. And so I do think there's like backdoor, high level, perspectives that could totally shift, radically shift balance of power, not only in Hawaiʻi, but really in the nation by setting precedent in some of these kind of interpretations. It's a lifelong goal for some of you guys. Yeah, and then just to tack on to Albie's thing, in addition to following and tracking and testifying on legislature, actually writing your own legislature. I know when I was in school, I thought policy was, I thought it was some untouchable, unreachable thing, and wasn't until my mid-30s that I ended up engaging in politics at all, and you realize that, your legislature, they're just people, and you can totally talk to them, you can pitch them ideas, you can work with them to craft bills, and it was a lot more attainable than I ever thought it was as a youth. And, maybe as law students, you guys don't have that issue that I had at your age. But yeah, if you see opportunities for government imposed or sanctioned solutions, get aggressive and pitch it to your legislators and, draft bills and be like, hey, we want to see this, and, it can happen.
Okay, so we're about to delve into the question and answer from the student or the audience. We just want to ask if there's anything that you would like to add before we jump into that.
No, let's do it.
Okay.
No, I'm sure things will come up.
Yeah.
Okay, so I thought this question was really interesting. It's if you could change one thing about the US food system tomorrow, what would it be?
And if it was just one thing, I'd probably just eliminate subsidies to better level the playing field. Would have horrible ramifications. But yeah, it's hard to see, a lot of our local and small producers just struggle against an unfair playing field. And yeah, it's rough. I don't know. There's a lot of things, but that is a good question.
I guess I agree with Noah. My secondary one would be that, some of our environmental quality laws and things such as pesticide regulation would be based on a precautionary principle as opposed to the way it seems to be operating, which is, open field testing on the human population. So much more strict environmental and public health regulation in the food and ag sector.
Another question we have is, how has COVID affected the work for more food sovereignty, and what impacts and effects has that had?
Unfortunately not the lasting effect I think we wanted to see, at least from my perspective. And we work closely with a lot of the food hubs, most of whom supplied, largely tourism markets before COVID. And when COVID hit, for instance, the Hawaiʻi cooperative, we lost like 90+% of our market, like in a 2-week period, and totally had to pivot. And so pivoted to, retail sales, to online sales, push forward a lot of product development that we were kind of like not rushing. And we saw a lot of the hubs do that. So a lot of the hubs were focused on restaurants, pivoted to federal feeding programs that were funded, and to local markets. And then COVID ended, and 80% of them went back to their old markets, because they are reliable. They often pay a slight premium compared to local markets. And, there's a tremendous amount of rhetoric during COVID, that acknowledged the food insecurity that Hawaii has. And if you guys haven't seen Ketchup and M&Ms, I think it's a great documentary that talks about that just-in-time food delivery system that Albie was sharing about. And I don't know, it just feels like a lot of the rhetoric evaporated as soon as the tourism market came back. And there were some permanent changes, right? So of the food hubs anyway, they shifted to local food, CSAs, community feeding, this. So 80% of them went back, but 20% stayed and we still did some of those local programs. And so there was an increase, but it was like this huge spike, and then it dropped back down, and it settled in marginally higher than it was before COVID. So I don't know. That's kind of what I saw.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I do think that the COVID shock raised awareness of our kind of systemic vulnerability and how many people, with a slight to severe economic contraction, became profoundly food insecure. Middle-class families lined up miles-long car lines in order to get emergency food. And so I felt like that, it's hard to really understand what were the true lessons learned, but I do think it helped people understand the nature of our vulnerability here in Hawaii. And it started a lot of conversations, and food system change, as Noah and I frequently talk about, these are generational changes. And often it comes as a result, like many social change elements, is there has to be some kind of crisis. And I think that COVID was a crisis that raised awareness about our systemic vulnerability and how many people are food insecure and living paycheck to paycheck. And then COVID-19 exacerbated that standing crisis.
No, just put another plug for ketchup and M&Ms because we always talk about food security as a physical thing, like, oh, what if the hurricane comes and the port goes down? And it's a real threat, but I mean, the much bigger threat is economic shock, right? Hawaii's the very end of the supply chain. And it's not that the barges will stop coming, it's that there's not going to be anything to put on the barges to come here. And we're lucky, I mean, Chad Buck was, you know, pulling every string and relationship he had in the nation to be getting food to Hawaii because the supply chain was the issue. It wasn't, you know, that, you know, the boats couldn't come. It was that everybody needed food and everyone was fighting over who gets it. And there's a lot of things that could cause that globally. You know, and so it doesn't have to be a hurricane in Hawaii. It could be, you know, a drought in the Midwest, or it could be a war in Ukraine that causes these supply chain shocks that mean Hawaii doesn't get theirs, you know, and that's where I think our real vulnerability lies.
Okay, yeah.
What would be the ideal legal framework to allow us to be more self-sustaining?
I'm not sure I understand that question.
Because it's like,
Yeah, and you know, my law. I can talk about my one law class you guys if you want. I'm just kidding.
Okay, given the current political climate, in what ways do you think initiatives towards food sovereignty will be affected?
Oh, man. Oh, yeah, that's another good question. I mean, I think the shortest and immediate answer is I don't know. It just feels like there's a lot of chaos and, you know, I also don't think you know how people are going to respond to things like this. You know, and sometimes I think, you know, there's the kind of equal and opposite reaction type of thing where, you know, kind of surprisingly, like, yeah, people respond in ways you don't expect. But yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's a good question. You know, certainly, like right now, you know, there's a lot of kind of our conventional food system taking like a major economic hit. You know, so tons of USDA and NRCS funding, which disproportionately goes to larger producers and commodity crop producers. You know, those funds are frozen or not flowing as they're supposed to. Some things have been outright canceled. And so, I mean, I think we're certainly going to see, you know, food price increases, some food shortages stemming from that, which actually could open the door, right, to make, you know, niche local things more viable. So I mean, I think in a weird, perverse way, like it could have a positive effect on some of our outcomes here in Hawaii. But yeah, it's really hard to say, and it's really hard to know exactly where this administration's trying to go with a lot of this stuff. And so yeah, it's a tough one to answer, but how do you think, given the current administration, it might impact food sovereignty locally here in Hawaii?
Oh goodness, yeah. They're giving us softball.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure Noah mentioned this, is he and I think just between the two of us, we probably have had $50+ million in federal grants be torpedoed. So, you know, and what we have been working on, for example, the project I'm working on is a climate smart commodities project, right? It's really designed to help Hawaii farmers begin transitioning to conservation agricultural practices, anticipating the impacts of climate destabilization and severe weather. And so because climate change is a taboo subject, that $40 million has essentially been cut. And NOAA has, other projects that were also cut. And so that's really, undermining our ability to both mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change that will be, bearing down on us and will continue to bear down on us. And that limits the ability of Hawaiʻi farmers to continue to produce and, maintain any semblance of conservation practices on their farms. And so I'm quite critical and concerned about the seemingly randomness that the Trump administration is approaching at least federal grants. And I think, depending upon, I was very concerned about, with Elon Musk and taking a hatchet to everything, that they're going to cut the, supplemental nutrition and assistance program, and that would, precipitate significant increase in household food insecurity. But one of the things, we'll see what happens, of course, but there's also a lot of big corporate players like Walmart and Costco and so forth that redeem a significant amount of our federal tax dollars via the SNAP program. And so I don't think that that's going to be cut because big business is actually supported through the SNAP program, somewhat ironically. So I probably didn't answer the question, but I'll give the mic to Noah.
Yeah. I'd say the other interesting wild card, it just all feels like wild cards with this administration, but Robert F. Kennedy as the head of FDA is also just really fascinating. Because for local producers and processors, like food safety is a huge barrier. And I don't agree with 99% of Robert Kennedy's statements, but I do think our country has gone very extreme on the food safety level to the point that it's become a huge barrier for small producers, right, to meet these extremely high standards that are written for big industrialized food systems, right? And so, I mean, could just be another wild card of him eliminating, right? They're talking about, oh yeah, raw milk's fine, you do this, just eliminating a lot of these food safety issues, which again could have a weird, way of actually empowering local community-based food systems that that you can't, and actually a lot of the community food systems I engage in don't participate in things like food security, right? Because people do go hunt wild boar and prepare it and smoke meat and share that, right? That's not food safe, because you can't do that, right? So so there's these balances of these large processes, right? And major feeding systems, but then there's these, ground up individual and community food systems. And, I guess getting back maybe to the earliest question of systemic barriers, right? One of the systemic barriers is probably applied blanket rules to these components of our food system at totally different scales, right? So in theory, if you're just a hunter occasionally hunting and sharing out the meat you catch, you're held to the same food safety standards and laws as, whatever, Nestle chocolate that's sourcing globally and has multi-million-dollar factories and doing all this stuff, right? And so, I mean, maybe there needs to be some consideration, right, of the scale that people are engaging in when we start thinking about how all these laws and regulations are enacted. But yeah, I do think that is a systemic barrier as well.
You both touched upon corporate influence that affects food sustainability, and one of the questions we have is actually, how do you see corporate influence impacting Hawaii's ability to develop a food system charter?
But
That's your.
yeah, I don't know that there's any opposition from, corporate enterprises around a food system plan or charter, but they are very actively engaged at the state legislature when it comes to issues such as pesticide regulation. So, common sense pesticide regulation based on the epidemiological literature around organophosphate pesticide exposure in communities and the increased risk of cognitive impairment in developing children would suggest that there would be sizable buffer zones around communities, public schools, and so forth. But the industry has consistently weighed in to oppose some of those very, very simple measures to protect populations that might be exposed to pesticide drift and pesticide residues. So I think, again, less opposition to a state level food system plan or charter process, more around specific environmental regulations that might cut into their ability to operate as they have.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to that one yet.
What safeguards can be put in place to protect community-led food system efforts from being co-opted?
Well, I think, having citizens actively engaged in the legislative process. So again, going back to this food system planning bill, the more people who show up and provide testimony, the more that bill language is going to reflect the interests and priorities of the community. And when the planning process, if it's successful, gets underway, there's going to be community fora to solicit input from community members. So, and the people who are behind this are very dedicated to participatory input. So even though we may be very cynical about the state legislature, and I understand why, there are opportunities to weigh in and provide your technical opinion, your personal opinion about what should this thing look like, whether it's a food system planning bill or any other piece of legislation that's at the state legislature. It nuances developed through the testimony process. So again, I'll speak to the food system planning bill. It is designed to be interagency and participatory in nature, and we need to show up and take some control over that process and not be passive, because otherwise it'll move along without our input.
Yeah, and I don't know about community food systems themselves, but I mean, we think about this a lot in terms of the crops. As we revitalize our indigenous crops and, oftentimes they gain some momentum, then you do typically have foreign, players come in and want to kind of ride that wave and be able to cash in on that as well. And we don't have an answer. We do think about it a lot. I think a huge part is just communication and education. So really understanding, where your food comes from and what you're buying with your food dollar. So who you're supporting and what are the broader values, right, wrapped around those organizations. But yeah, it's a really hard one because yeah, exactly. Once you get successful, once you're generating revenues or profits, that's often when other people want to come in and be like, oh yeah, good idea. Let me get in on that. But yeah, it's very hard to protect. We'd be very open to ideas if anyone has any.
Someone asked a fun question actually for Noah, which is which variety of cultivars of ulu or breadfruit is most famous in Hawaii, and how do you see people of Hawaii like to eat it?
Nice. Well, the most famous variety, I mean, is our Maoli variety, the Hawaiian variety. So we I don't know, it's interesting. So common wisdom says there was only one variety here before Europeans. But we've been doing a lot of work over the last decade of going to very remote locations that like, some of the North Shore valleys on Molokai, right, that have been uninhabited now for several generations and collecting ulu varieties from these really remote locations. And I do think there's actually two traditional varieties that are widespread in Hawaii. But they're not really distinguished. They're both just kind of called ulu. And that's, I would say locally our most famous variety. And yeah, what'd you like to do with it? What was the second question? Second part? How do I like to prepare it? Man, I like a lot of ways. If it's your first time cooking ulu, I suggest just like throwing it in a curry or a stew. You can't mess it up, and it's gonna like absorb all that flavor and be super yummy. My personal favorite way, I usually do like twice cooked patties. So I'll like steam it, mash it up with like onions and the parents and spices, and then make patties and then pan fry them, and then those are good. And, but I mean, to me, the great thing about ulu is it's super versatile, so you can eat it as a baby fruit, as like a vegetable, have like wonderful like pickled ulu salads and things like that. And then, it gets potatoey and you can do whatever you want with it, I mean, at home we'll like slice it super thin and put it in a lasagna in place of the noodles and it soaks everything up and gets nice. And then you let it ripen and it gets all soft and sweet, and then you can like make desserts out of it and like, custardy kind of things. And yeah, it's super, super versatile crop. So yeah, it's fun to experiment with.
Okay, so we have a positive question for our last question. Yeah, what's one glimmer opposite of a trigger that gives you hope about the future of Hawaii's food system?
It's a glimmer, not a trigger.
Yeah, glimmer of hope for the food system.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've been really heavily involved with the Hawaiʻi Ulu Producers Co-op. Me and my wife founded it 9 years ago, and she's really managed it and taken it on its trajectory. So we started with 9 member farms, like, yeah, 8 or 9 years ago now. And the first year I was like driving around in my pickup truck, going to farms, like collecting their ulu. And one of our 9 members owned a restaurant in Hilo, so we would go at the restaurant after hours and like process ulu like all night long. And then we had like a chest freezer in our garage and like storing ulu in our chest freezer. And just that whole like first year, like I feel like every month there's like this is not gonna work, It's like one reason or the other, right? Like, oh my God, like we got 2,000 pounds of ulu, like it's not selling, like this is never gonna work, and then 3 months later it's like we're out of ulu and we can't fill our orders, like this is never gonna work. But just watching like the growth and momentum and really the joy and relationships that have come out of that. So we now have like 185 farmer members across 4 islands, 2 processing facilities and 2 processing partnerships. But most important is just this amazing, like awesome network of farmers who are like super passionate, like they're all, well, not all, like 95% of them are diversified farmers. They're growing like all sorts of things. Like all of them are like none, I can't say it for sure, but I don't think any of our farmers like spray pesticides like at all. And it's just this like, yeah, I don't know. It's been a really hopeful thing for me just to see like how fast it's grown, like how impactful it's been, like how much a lot of people love it, how it's like changed people's eating habits, how it's like been able to be a storyline for like what we can do in our state. and yeah, it's just been overall, I mean, it's definitely had its challenges, but like, it's been one of the things over the last decade that's kept me really positive in working in our food system. Like I could not get down in the political trenches like Albie does. I would get way too depressed. But yeah, like working with the farmers and just just seeing that growth and the enthusiasm. There's so much enthusiasm in it all. And that's that's been my glimmer. It's been more than a glimmer. It's been like a bright
I like that.
spotlight. Yeah.
I'll keep this concise. I have my students read a paper by a social theorist by the name of Gail Feenstra, and she talks about food system change happens when we create social, intellectual, political, and economic space. And social spaces are being created all the time. This is a social space where people are convening to talk about food sovereignty. There's a Future of Food and Agriculture in Hawaii speaker series. Noah and I run a brown bag on agri-food issues in Hawaii. We were seeing more coverage in Civil Beat and Star Advertiser. So I feel like the food system is becoming much more of a common frame of reference. The documentaries that Noah referred to. So food system change, the problematic aspects of the food system, I think are much more in common conversation. So in these social spaces, people begin to ideate, right? We begin to think about the problem set that we face and how we're going to begin solving for it. So that's the kind of the intellectual work. And then there's the economic space. Noah's example of the Ulu co-op is a prime example, right? There's growers being organized through this co-op, and now they're generating millions of dollars in value from all of the food products that they're producing. And then the political space, the things that I mentioned before, the food system planning bill, all these different pieces of legislation. And though these things have occurred in the past, I feel my sense is maybe I'm just wishful thinking and but I feel like those things are starting to reach a certain scale. And to me, it's very promising. And I will say, the formation of our new Kale Mouse Center. Noah and I have been collaborating for the last decade, and now we're working together on this new center, inviting students, faculty to come collaborate with us. And so all that to me is very exciting and gives me a great deal of hope. And of course, it's never happening fast enough, right? We'd like to see this type of systemic change happen much more rapidly, but I do feel like we're starting to build some inertia. And the last thing I'll mention is, Noah and I are working on an initiative, that really tracks young people who are interested in food and agricultural studies into the University of Hawaii system. We're trying to build a higher education in Hawaii in agroecology and sustainable food systems. And so we're trying to do all these things simultaneously. That's why we're so crazy. But I think it gives me hope that, I like working at a systems level, right? And Noah works at a systems level. And I do feel like we're having some small but important impact on system change. So that's it.
Thank you so much, both of you. And please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists. Thank you so much for sharing your mana'o today and for joining us tonight. Please, if there's leftover food, you're welcome to continue to eat, stay and chat with the panelists. And we're looking forward to seeing you at our climate change event on Thursday.
Thank you.
I might steal away Dr. Lincoln though, so he can get us flight back to the big guy.
Oh yeah, I work in a really. Yeah,
Also,
it is.
my sister.
Yeah.